Pavah, the slice. With haste, she slid the knife between the vegetables that were thrown in front of her upon each time she finished the ones before. She sliced them into halves and then quarters before dicing them. As a group in a hurry, they filled the bowls to their right that were taken away once they were full and ready to be added to the upcoming feast. Pavah's father forbade the idea of her being around such sharp things. The dark reasoning behind it was the only thing that seemed to loom in her worrying mind. Yet the marriage between village folk was a rare occasion for those she lived with. She wanted so badly to be as involved in the preparation as she could possibly be. It was her mother's natural charm and persuasion that brought about the inevitable acceptance from her cautious father. She could only imagine how worried he would be in these very moments of her absence from home. One mistake could mean undoubtedly horrible things for her and her family. She stood in the shanty bakery with half a dozen other girls who were also helping. The two in the corner knitted daisies together, creating sweet bracelets and necklaces for the children. The rest were hard at work, leaning over the long table of carrots, corn, and cabbages that they sheared down swiftly. One of the girls kept the air warm with her smooth humming. It fought hard to rid the space of any pressure, replacing it with only fond memories to their minds from the days of gatherings and celebrations in their youth. She took no risk with the blade she held, though it resulted in her falling behind on her work. It was to her surprise that none of the girls acknowledged the fact that she wasn't filling the bowls at their pace, though it had also seemed they weren't aware of her even being present in the room. Pavah didn't mind. In fact, she would prefer it if she could easily avoid drawing the risky attention of the girls around her. She was not prepared for any questions they might ask about her rare presence within the village. The silence came mostly from the girls having been in deep focus with narrowed brows over their boards of sliced greens, but there was another reason that words were dire among them. The village was in an unspoken mourning, one that began in the early dawn of the day before when a letter from the capital had arrived, one sealed in a dreaded black ribbon. It was a seal that was easily recognized and feared in Eskimar. Letters that wielded them only ever had a single grim topic written inside of them: death. Emmeline Vieren was in their thoughts as they sliced, and the family she left behind were also in their silent prayers. She was the widow of the past emperor and the esteemed mother of the current man who ruled their great country. She was known solely for her everlasting kindness that she bestowed on the people that lived on her land. It seemed the soul of her late husband lived on through hers as she continued his work of being a strong and admirable leader. The stories that the village spread of her were no less than noble. Together they painted a picture of this prominent monarch with a long list of divine achievements in her life. She was no doubt incredible. Pavah could only admire her for what she was and everything she read about her in her years of isolation. Candles were of course lit in every window, and several flowers were stuck in the ground along the paths of her village. It became a morbidly beautiful tradition for her home to perform when death stripped good souls from the world. Dwindling on the topic of death was not something Pavah pursued. She knew all too much about it and those who would wish it upon someone like her. She shook it from her mind after finishing her final prayer. Then her eyes fell back onto the unsliced carrot beneath her. The smell of the cooling pastries was yet another smell that breathed into the air around them. She had only wished she had arrived earlier to assist with the dough and the moulding of the many breads that don't require the handling of knives.
"Have you seen the dress?"
One of the younger girls called out to the table as she sliced through the silence and yet another plump cabbage.
"Madam Reed has been sewing it for months. I hear the veil is longer than the bridge."
Each of the girls seemed to twitch in excitement at the mention of it, or perhaps it was their unconscious attempt to retreat from the dull thoughts of loss they had been feeling. Pavah could only listen as they swapped more thoughts and opinions about the upcoming wedding, mostly about the bride and her thousands of potential hair choices.
"She should lace ribbons through it, like the fancy women do up in the capital,"
the girl beside her added.
"I'm far too concerned with my own hair, Serene. I definitely know the perfect style I want. I just know it will go perfect with the dress I plan to wear,"
the girl went on as she positioned her shining hair behind her neck.
"I want it in a single braid running down my back, much like hers."
Pavah had almost overlooked the finger pointing right at her from across the table. She immediately felt the eyes of every girl looking at her familiar, thick braid of black, flimsy hair she kept at her back.
"Perhaps a little more tidy, of course."
The girl smirked.
"Did you do that yourself?"
"Yes," Pavah uttered with a slight and subtle smile.
"I can tell."
Each of the girls giggled under their breaths at her clumsy work, forcing her to bow her head once again and try to block out their long and tedious talk of hair and gowns. During their ongoing discussion, Pavah began catching up to the girls, and soon she moved on to her next task, placing the tough cabbage in front of her and pressing the knife into it with her hand as far from the blade as it could reach. The stem fought back like it was bone. Pavah moved her hand further up the handle and pushed with her weight, and used her other arm to grip the cabbage tightly and hold it steady in place. She could sense the onlookers in the kitchen fall out of their talks with one another to watch her in her struggle, some smiling, while others gritted their teeth. "Do you need help?" One of the voices spoke across the table before being hushed by one of the others. Pavah silently declined, fighting on against it and drowning in the embarrassment. She heard more giggles at her losing battle. Her tensing stomach forced her to press even harder. Her throat tightened under the veins that bulged from it. She continued to push fiercely, so hard that the knife slid right out from the cabbage and slashed open the thing that seized it. Her arm! The knife sliced through her brown skin and flesh in an instant, leaving a deep gash in its path. The haunting sight of blood pouring from it panicked Pavah and the hysterical girls around the table. But her draining bloody wrist was not what spawned the fear and panic. It was the haunting color of what oozed from her wound. It was black. A deep and daunting black, much like ink that splattered over the oak surface and the vegetables that sat on it. Pavah cried aloud and stumbled back before reverting to a sick silence, looking only at the terrified faces of the girls that took several shaky steps away, glaring at her like she was a stray bear. "Gods!" one of the girls stuttered in utter disbelief. Pavah clutched her arm as her blood drenched her hand and the floor. Her breath went heavy and almost unmanageable. "Please, don't tell them! Please don't, I beg you!" Without a single thought, each of the girls sprinted from the bakery as they screamed.
"Black blood!"
The first girl screeched as she burst out through the door. Pavah ran frantically forward and tackled the last girl to cross the table, grabbing her arm with her bloody hand and meeting her frightened gaze, holding the same look in her own eyes.
I'm not like them. Please, I don't want to hurt anyone. I swear it.
The girl shoved her away in disgust and shook her arm violently at the sight of the black blood staining her skin. She looked down at it with tears in her eyes, as if it were venom seeping into her flesh and burning it away. She ran from the bakery and left Pavah alone and in fear as she listened to the shouts outside, spreading like a plague. Home, she told herself. Her lungs were in hysterics as she ran out into the open air. Her arm rained black blood and dyed the dirt beneath her. There was the dreaded sight of the frightened girls hugging each other in peril and pointing at her while explaining the horror they had seen. They could all see it now. Every one of the villagers could spot the pitch-black blood that trickled down her fingers. The sight of the colour made their faces turn to utter scorn and dismay, like they had caught a glimpse of a demon. Upon seeing raised fists and heavy feet hurrying towards her, Pavah hurried away in a panic to find her family and prayed that they would help shield her from the bellowing people that began stalking her like wolves trailing a lamb. The run through the village was painful. So many faces twitched and fell at the glimpse of her. Many joined the growing crowd and yelled out alongside them. Such vile and haunting words came from their barking mouths. The land sloped. Her sunken part of the village that was built on thick mud was now surrounding her. The ground pulled at her feet, but didn't prevail. The threat of approaching blades and curses forced her forward. Her heart beat so fast that the pain of her sliced flesh was not a bother to her any more. The petite cottage appeared in the distance. It was her only chance at help. It held the only people she had ever trusted in the world. Trudging swiftly forward as the shouts had grown louder, she collided with the door and threw it open, slamming it behind her and sealing off the sounds of sickening words. Her body was on the verge of collapse. She leaned against the wood and slid down it as she began to tear up. In her eyes, she could see her black tears, just as black as her blood that began falling down her cheeks as she wept in shame and terror. The heavy bangs from the other side of the wood woke her from her cries and reminded her of the torment awaiting her. She backed away and stared at the shaking latch, just waiting for it to snap before 100 hands grabbed hold of her. "Pavah!" a warm and worried voice called. The face of her scared mother appeared from the steep spiral staircase. She held out her arms for her mother and sobbed into her shoulder, shaking all over. "I'm sorry! I'm so sorry! They saw me!" Pavah's weeping overthrew the noise outside with ease. She could feel her mother's hand stroking through her hair.
"What's happening out there?"
a strident second voice demanded. Her father's heavy feet marched down to them, drawing his eyes firstly to the cracking door, then to the blood that soaked his floorboards. His anger boiled like molten steel. Pavah's mother was useless as a shield and was pushed aside in an instant.
"I told you not to leave!"
He clamored with eyes like fire, breaking the air around her. "I'm so sorry!" Pavah bellowed back in a broken cry, weeping in terror at how much rage and fear she had caused among her family. "Please help me! Please, you have to help me, Father! They're going to kill me!" The wood of the door was losing its battle against pounding fists and scratching blades. The latch was doomed to fail at any moment.
"We warned her,"
Pavah's father snapped, looking to his wife with fresh tears that were clear, unlike his daughter's.
"So many times over the years we warned her not to go out of that door without us at her side, and you were stupid enough to trust her."
Her father grabbed Pavah tightly,
yanking her violently towards the only thing between her and the cursing voices without any hesitation.
No!
Pavah screamed along with her mother, who swatted him down in anguish. He shoved her aside once more as Pavah's 2 younger sisters appeared from the other room, with their ears covered.
If she stays, they will take us too. You, me, and our girls will be dragged out of here.
Pavah's weak hands couldn't shift him at all. His large body blocked her from seeing her sisters one last time. With a sudden and unexpected kiss on her forehead, her father pulled the door open and shoved her outside, slamming the door shut and shielding the cries of her sisters and mother.
Please!
She screamed while clawing her nails in the wood and banging against the door with all of her dying strength. Her braid was hauled aggressively, ripping at her scalp and pulling her from her feet, flat onto her back in the mud. Dozens of horrified faces looked down at her in disgust. She watched on in peril as they passed while her body was dragged viciously along, despite her pleas with them.
Witch!
They called in anger.
Whore! Demon!
The undersides of thick boots and clenched fists hit her through each passing second. They beat her mercilessly, without restraint or remorse. Spit rained over her as well as mud and seeping blood. The torture had come and gone in flashes, just like the pain that was juggled between all parts of her shattering body. Hands ripped at her muddy dress. The feeling of her exposed skin was the most haunting as she looked at the 100 eyes that stalked over her body.
Take the bitch to the carriage!
She heard the chanters yell through her bloody ears. They hardly lifted her. They took pleasure letting her be dragged some more and letting people get a few more beatings in on her. The stalls were stripped down as she passed. It wasn't long before the fruits were lunged at her with dozens of more cruel words. Her nose, her eyes, her mouth, they leaked with black and left a trail behind her. The swelling and the ink-like tears made it harder to see what was happening, but the feeling of arms beneath her gave her a daunting idea. She was being carried to the infamous carriage. It didn't take long at all for her to make out the shadow of the gates overhead, as if they wanted her out of their sight as soon as possible. More hands grabbed onto her, restraining her wrists and legs with their strength and drawing her closer to the open door of the daunting carriage that had 2 sickened men sitting on it.
Away with you!
Voices called amid the crying of children. Her struggling body was forced into the small wooden carriage. She kicked and lashed out desperately in an attempt to escape her new cell on wheels. But with that came the consequence of a hard punch to her face by a brawn man. In her weakened state, they quickly stuffed her inside. Her arm reached out back to the outside before being crushed in the slamming door, forcing a yelp of pain from her as she pulled back a hand of mangled fingers that she clutched closely to her chest. With one hard whip of the reins, Pavah felt the horses pull the carriage along, rocking her within her cage of shrinking wood. The glass window was smothered in foulness as the villagers lunged anything they could at it, such as the apples from the stalls or the horse dung from the pathways. The shouts and horrid words were fading so suddenly. Her home was being ripped from her before her eyes, and the distance only grew through each painful passing second.
No!
She cried out, realizing so much in those terrifying moments, thinking about where the carriage was taking her and the new identity those villagers and her family would remember her by. A filthy black blood, nothing more and nothing less. There was no fear in her that bloomed from the unknown. She knew exactly where she would soon be arriving. She knew of its reputation of being the most cruel place in the empire and home to the most wretched of people, the people like her. Over 2 decades of hiding the darkness that ran through her veins, only to have it become known because of her foolishness with a knife. And now her punishment awaited her at the end of the long, rotten journey ahead of her. The marshes.